Hi, Tony from all the remote things here again today. I have the wonderful Diana Larsen with me. How are you today, Diana?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's
It's
actually your yesterday where I am right now.
that's yeah. You were saying you're as far away, as far on the coast as you can get in America, unless you go to Alaska or Hawaii. Correct?
Yes.
Brilliant. And of course, I'm sitting on an island, so between the two of us, we're as far distributed as you possibly could get.
Yeah.
So as usual, Diana, would you like to introduce yourself to anybody who's watching who, if there's anybody in the far-flung corners who don't know you?
Oh, there are lots of people who don't know me. Well, I am a person who had the great good fortune of intersecting with some of the very early movers and shakers in Agile, folks who were Agile Manifesto signers several years after I met them. And we discovered that the work I was doing at the time, which was work process redesign, and the work they were doing had some nice intersections. And that has enabled me to bring my sort of special experiences, background, expertise into Agile and allowed me to contribute in a lot of ways, most of which show up in the books I've written. And people are most familiar with me for that. But I was also involved in the Agile Alliance board, and I really feel very connected to the Agile community. As I often say, when I found Agile and the people there, I found my tribe. And so I feel like a tribal elder at this point.
And we have a lot of mutual connections, and we've never actually got to meet together. So it was fantastic to get you on the cast. I mean, because we obviously, Esther Derby, who's been on the cast, shout out to Esther, and Craig Smith, who's on the Agile Alliance board, is one of my very, very close friends. We're all interconnected, but finally got you on the cast, so I'm really, really happy for that. And you mentioned the book, so everybody will know the retrospective book that yourself and Esther put together, and I'm not going to go too much into that today, other than to say it is being re-released, so make sure that you do get a copy of that when it comes out, because it's been sort of updated for the modern day where we're at right now. But I do want to delve into a couple of books, and one of the ones that I'm really interested in delving into, because it struck a chord with me when I first read it, and it's called Liftoff. And I don't know if a lot of people know it, but they should. I think it's the actual title, and I'll read that for them. It's Liftoff, Launching Agile Teams and Projects. And the thing for me when I read it was that I reread it recently, which was, part of that. And I was thinking to myself as I was reading it, this is more poignant today than it ever was. So, firstly, let's talk about how it came about and where all the ideas came from, and then how you see that interacting with today.
Yeah. Well, so like the retrospective book, the genesis of the Liftoff book was noticing from my background doing work process redesign and that almost every time. I don't know that every time anybody did work process redesign, they end up with self-organizing cross-functional teams. But I know that every organization I took those principles into, they ended up choosing to develop cross-functional self-organizing, self-managing, we called them in the 90s. And so, so there were some things I learned from that experience about putting teams together, giving them the best possible start and so on, that I didn't see represented in the body of Agile practices. And I became close friends and dear colleagues with a couple of folks. One of the gentleman named Three, who had been doing a kind of chartering in software teams, and his partner, Ainsley Neese, who became my co-author on this book. And she had been applying some of the chartering principles in her work when she was kind of an Uber project manager at Hewlett Packard. And so we put our heads together and we said, the one thing that's missing when we look across all these practices and all these things that people are talking about in the Agile world, no one is talking about how do you help a team get started? what happens there at the very beginning? I mean, people might talk about getting them some training, or they might talk about, different things, but they didn't really talk about how do we help this group of people function well together and get started as a collaborative team. And so that was really it. We said, we know some stuff about that. That's a place that we could contribute something that at that point was fairly unique into the Agile community. And so then we got started on that. However, I must say the book you have is the first edition. There is a second edition that came out in 2016 that has a slightly different title. That's what gave it away.
Oh, there you go.
The new one is called Liftoff, or the newer one is called Liftoff: Start and Sustain Successful Agile Teams. Because by the time we wrote that one, the movement away from project thinking and toward product thinking had already gotten underway. And we wanted to be sure to reflect that in the second edition. And so we had to change the title, the colon, after the colon part of the title. But yeah, I mean, we added in some new things. We did go through and look at every word in the book like you need to do when you're writing a second edition, but most of it is close to the same. Yeah.
See, now I got caught out because I actually have really physical books. That's
yes.
Yeah. I'm still one of those people who likes to turn the physical.
Me too. And I have both. I have both editions of a lot of books that I've purchased over the years. But I would, if anybody wants to go out and check it out, I would encourage them to check out the second edition. Yeah.
And I think that's great, because the reason I bring that book up is that within the organization, like where I worked, we started Agile very, very early in the 2000s, etc. And one of the things that we worked through as we got there, and when I was reading this book, I was on a particular program of work that was very, very large, and we were putting together, and had the concept of iteration zero or sprint zero or whatever you want to call it, and that's that thing. What does everybody need to get started, right? And I'd read this, and it just made sense. And I love the analogy. So that's the other thing, is the analogy about the rocket ship and the launch and what you need to get started. Talk to me a little bit about how you thought about that, because that for me is why I was able to absorb it so easily.
Yeah. Well, at that time, people did talk about kickoffs and boot camps and a lot of metaphors that Ainsley and I weren't entirely comfortable with. And so we said, what do we think, what do we want to call this thing that we're talking about? Because we have the element of chartering teams as a part of it, but a liftoff is actually more than just chartering. It is examining all the elements that this team is going to need. Do they have the right tooling? Do they have, all of those kinds of things? And sometimes there are multiple teams being lifted off at the same time. I mean, I had an experience once of lifting off 11 teams all at the same time from the same organization. We had a ballroom. Everybody had their own space. And, but there's a lot of things people need to know, and it was about helping the teams understand the resources available to them, and creating from the beginning that close connection between the product people, whomever they may be. In Agile Fluency model, we call them business liaisons, because every organization seems to have a different. Some there are a lot that call them product owners, but there are a lot that call them other things too.
Yeah,
so,
that's
whoever is providing that function of helping the team understand what it is, why they've been spun up, why is the organization doing whatever they're asking this team to do, and so we were talking about those kinds of things, and the idea of getting that initial accelerated start was really what we were talking about. It's like, this is the way we help teams get into being productive more quickly. how do, they don't have to thrash around and figure out a lot of things, because we're going to give them some dedicated time to figure that out to begin with, in an effective and efficient kind of way. It actually is much more efficient than just putting a team in a room, as one famous agilist once said. Well, just put the team in the room and close the door, and they'll self-organize.
Yeah, that's it. Let them work it out. Let them work it out, right?
And I said, you know what? They will, yes, they will self-organize to get themselves out of the room.
Yeah.
No one likes that sense of being trapped. And so what is it people need to know and do? And so the metaphor actually of the rocket ship, that there's a burst of energy that's needed in the beginning, so that then the trajectory can happen. And so we write about that metaphor quite a bit, right in the beginning of the book, because that was really meaningful to us. And it was also because my stepfather, who is very dear to me, and is going to be turning 94 in another few days. He at the time was a honest to gosh rocket scientist, right? And he worked on the metals of rockets, and what stress dynamics they could deal with, and so on. And so I was talking to him one day, and I said, people say, oh, it's not rocket science, just do it, right? And I said, how, what is rocket science? What happens when, and they said, he told me, he said, there's the liftoff, and there's that initial, escaping the atmosphere. And he said, from there, it's small corrections. You are never exactly on target to where you're going, because you're constantly you're making these small corrections, much like sailing. He's also a sailor, much like sailing, you're constantly doing that. And so we thought, wow, that really makes sense to us for agile teams, because we need this acceleration, and then we'll do retrospectives, and we'll kind of keep adjusting and stay on target and keep improving until we get where we need to go. And we may not know where we need to go until right before we get there. And so the whole metaphor made sense to us, and it allowed us to, and it felt more positive than talking about kicking things or military metaphors, or those kinds of things. It allowed us to kind of move away from that and into something that we felt would be more neutral and appealing to more folks.
And as I said, for myself, I found that easy as well. One thing that I used to add to it, just to tell you, is that when a rocket, I don't know if they still do it these days. I haven't watched a rocket launch for ages, but they have a scaffold that
right,
holds them in place, right? And as the rocket goes, the scaffold falls away. And to me, that's really how when you're forming the agile teams or programs at work, is you have all these things that you need scaffolded to get you started. But when you hit that liftoff phase, you want to accelerate your teams away from that, because they don't need that stuff anymore. And then it's those course corrections that get you where you need to go.
Right. Well, and that just enough. I like that idea, and that's what our intention was with the liftoff, was the idea that, particularly if you're moving toward teams that are high performing, or in our new book we call them resilient learning teams, or self-organizing teams, they need just enough structure. I love that you like metaphors, so I love the metaphor of picking up a handful of sand on the beach, right? Unless you cup your hand, if you just hold your hand flat, all the sand falls out, right? But if you hold your hand tightly, all the sand falls out.
Right. Okay.
Right. You have to give it just enough support and just enough structure for it to form and hold its shape. Right. And I think that the idea about the scaffolding, just enough structure to help it get started. And then after that, you don't need to do all of the liftoff and chartering anymore. You just, occasionally you'll look at the charter and say, this needs to be adjusted or that needs to be adjusted. But you never have to do the whole thing again. You just start with that good solid draft of a liftoff, and then they're able to keep going. Yeah.
That's brilliant. So I'll take a bit of a step to the right on this now and head into another book. And I spoke to you off air about this, is because you were talking about, accelerated learning, and you have a book that's called Rules for Accelerated Learning.
Yes.
And I don't know that it's well known, but it's one that I wanted to ask you about, is, how that came about. Probably expand on the rules just a tad for those who haven't read it, right?
Sure.
So.
Sure. Yeah. I wrote it with my son, and actually the most of it comes from the work that he was doing, which also actually ended up contributing to the fluency model, interestingly enough. But where we're really looking at how do people, it's been a thing that's always fascinated me. How do people learn? Particularly, how do people learn in groups, but how do people learn in general? And he had been really diving into that for his own purposes around language learning and helping people do language learning when he was involved in that. And so studied a lot of the literature, everything that was out there. And really it came down to sort of distilling into what we call the 5 rules of accelerated learning. And I love that it ended up with 5, because that allows me to keep track of them on the fingers of one hand, right? And so what we found was these rules apply in all situations. It's not just classroom learning. I think Training from the Back of the Room is a great book, but it's about being in the room, right? But now I think particularly software development is moving away from being knowledge work where we manipulate things we already know, to learning work where we are constantly needing to learn new things and explore new things. And so we need to be learning everywhere, not just when we're in a classroom. And so we were interested in finding what are the principles that actually support that. And so the 5 rules are: keep it alive, or we just call it alive is the shorthand for it. Keep it alive, which has to do with, remember, we're working with humans. And humans have all these wonderful qualities: sensory awareness, relationship awareness, connection with nature, all of those things. And the more we can build in those things that humans respond to, the better they will learn. Includes playfulness. You watch small children learn. One of the things I love to do is watch toddlers, right? Or babies and toddlers. They are just little learning machines. They are, from morn till night, wake up to sleep, they are learning. And they may probably even be learning in their sleep, for all I know. And so you watch, what are the kinds of things that they're responding to? How, what helps them learn, and so on. Really gives you some clues about that aliveness piece. And then the second one, which I think may be in a different order, but this is the order I like them in, it is settings. We call it settings first. And that is, what is the environment? Let's consider the environment that this learning is going to happen. Is it going to happen at work? Is it going to happen with a group of people in a mob? Is it going to be happening with a team where everyone's working independently? What, are they co-located? Are they remote? What is that setting? And how can we enhance that setting as much as possible, taking into account the other 4 rules? And then the next one, the next rule is fluency, or fluent. And the little tagline for it is do it for real.
Yeah.
The closer that we can get to actually simulating the conditions under which this learning needs to happen, the better people are going to learn it. So that's why, airline pilots have these very sophisticated flight simulators. It's why astronauts get dumped in swimming pools to practice being in weightlessness. We're getting as close as we can possibly can. And if we can actually be using the actual thing, the actual tools, the actual equipment, even better. And so for software, that also has to do with being close to the culture. If I'm building something for you for real, I need to be close to you for real to understand your needs for real, right? And so doing it for real is an important part of learning. And then the next one is called obvious. And that one we say start obvious, stay obvious. And it's to counter this idea that I used to have the experience of people saying they were going to teach me something and then doing a whole thing and then saying, now don't do it like that. Do it this other way. That was the wrong, it's like, why did you show me that? Right. So let's keep our learning as clear as possible, as focused as possible. What the other metaphor we use for that is the strongest possible signal that we're sending out. This is the thing we're learning, and we're staying focused on this thing. And then the last one is called focus. I mean, it's called flow, and our tagline is focus on flow. But the other part of it we often talk about is bite-sized pieces. And that rule is about how do we size and sequence our learning? How do we make sure we're not biting off more than we can chew? We want to learn just enough. I think the great metaphor is story slicing. We want to learn just enough so that we can integrate that and then know when we're ready to take on the next. Yeah. And so that kind of incremental learning, incremental improvement is very powerful. We can't, start by trying to learn 5 blind men and the elephant, right? We can't start trying to learn about the whole elephant. We have to start with the piece that's in front of us and then share what we learn. Yeah. That's actually a thing that's coming up in the new book, the Lead Without Blame book, is we talk a lot about how do we make sure that we're not overwhelming folks and that we're giving them the opportunity to learn in the way they need to learn. So, but those are the 5 rules: alive, setting, fluent, obvious, and flow. And
I asked that particular question for a reason, because I love that book. And that's why you threw me, because you did them out of order, which is cool. You get to do them out of order. But it's interesting because you have flow, right? And you talk about flow. Yeah. And you mentioned the Agile Fluency a couple of times now. So I'm going to flow over into that, because you're such a wonderful contributor to the agility in the community, and the Agile Fluency or the fluency model is well known, but I can see attributes of some of the things we were just talking about in that, which is why I asked those questions first and then flow into that. Let's talk a little bit about it and how it came together, because I think a lot of people know about it. And a lot of people ask about, well, how to use it, what is it, but how did you get there first?
Well, I've been so fortunate in the collaborators and people that I've been able to work with. So Esther, Ainsley, James Shore is another, Willem, my son, who's brilliant, and James Shore is another one. And James and I had been teaching a workshop, and it was a long work. It was a 5-day workshop, and it was called The Art of Agile Delivery, I believe, something like that. Anyway, it was based out of his book, but then adding in things like retrospectives and liftoffs and chartering and all of that. So it was a collaboration between the two of us. And so we would run this course, and we would get to the end and people would say, I really loved it, but I could have used a better overview at the beginning. We got into practices right away, and I really would have liked to have gotten an overview. And so then we rejiggered the course in response to that. I mean, people loved it, but they said, this would help us. So then we did another one, and we started with the overview, and then we went down we filtered down to specific practices. And then people said, we'd love the course, but we really needed to get into the nitty gritty, and you started us with this overview. And so we were sitting at the dining table going, well, they don't want us to do big picture to detail, and they don't want us to do detail to big picture. What do we do? What can we do to make this course, to continue to perfect this course? And so we were sitting there, we were talking about it, and we thought about some things that we had talked about with Willem in terms of language fluency. And by that time, I had already created another couple of fluency models for other things. And so we started talking about language fluency. And language has the American Council for Teachers of Foreign Language have a heuristic that they use, which is, you can become a fluent novice. You can become a fluent intermediate speaker. You can become a fluent advanced speaker. You can become a fluent superior speaker. And then there's another one that has to do with specialization. You speak in your field, the arcane language of your field as well. And we said, maybe what we need to do is say, well, what are those few things that somebody needs to get along, to get along as a novice if they're looking at planning and delivering Agile software or software in an Agile way? And then we can add in what is the intermediate part. So instead of taking one set of practices and going from, big picture to detail or from detail to big picture, we said, let's put together those pieces of practice and that across those different topic areas, let's put all those first steps that everybody needs to know, and we'll present those first. And then we'll add in, so in language terms, that would be daily greetings, simple questions like, where's the bus and how do I get to the toilet, and all those kinds of things, that tourist language, or language that you might use in your family if your family has a heritage language, but they aren't speaking it all the time, but that there's going to be songs or poetry or something that come up at holidays, or all of that is considered sort of the novice language. You're not really able to converse, but you're able to contribute, right? And then, so what would that be if we were looking at all the sets of Agile practices? And then what would it be if we added in a little more sophistication? So in languages, that's intermediate. That's now I can do lots of different kinds of questions and answers. I can speak in full sentences. I can, things like that. And maybe I can begin to tell a simple story with a past and present and future, and then it goes on to the advanced is where you can speak in whole paragraphs and, so and so on. So, and begin to discuss politics, which we're not going to discuss. We already decided. So Jim and I took a look at this body of skills and proficiencies and things that we were looking at for our workshop, and said, okay, what are the pieces that we would pull out that we think that we have seen that people need to know first? And so we started working that way. And then we said, well, gosh, maybe we could make a model out of this. So we constructed the first model. It was a pyramid. It was awful. But we took it to our local open space conference here in the Pacific Northwest. We have an annual, it's been going on since 2007, Agile Open Northwest, this conference. And so we said, well, let's go see what other folks think of it. So we took it there. We got a lot of good feedback on that. We came back, we iterated on it some more, and we did that. We did several rounds of that, and then we began sending it out beyond just our local community to other thought leaders and things that we knew. And practitioners. We made sure that we included in our kind of review rounds people who are actually on the ground practicing. And then finally, at the magic moment somewhere in 2011, early 2012, it came to the place where people said, this represents what I encounter when I come into organization. And so it started from that, trying to rejigger that workshop, and then just taking the ideas and vetting them over and over and over again with our community. And then, we mentioned earlier, Martin Fowler, the last thing we did before we published was we sent out the kind of our final review article we'd really worked hard on it, and we sent it out to a whole lot of people, and we said, is there anything that we're leaving out? Is there anything else we should be talking about here? And that's the first question. And then the second question was, is this publishable? And if so, where should we publish it? And so bless his heart, in the most sincere kind of way, Martin came back and said, it looks really good to me. It matches my experience. It matches the experience of a lot of other people that I work with. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to publish it on my website, on my blog. And so we just, who's going to turn that down?
No, yeah, you're right.
So very graciously, it got published in his Blicky, and the rest is kind of history. People started reading it, and Jim and I thought we were done at that point. It's like,
yes,
this is the model. We've described it. This is what we see. Maybe, other people can take it and use it however they want. We just put it out there. And after a few months, we started hearing from some folks who had actually done that, had taken it and were using it and working with it in their organizations. And then we heard from some other folks that said, we think it's wonderful, but we're not exactly sure how to operationalize it. We don't know how to actually do it in real life. How do you apply this model to? And so then so we started helping those folks develop some materials and different things to help them do that. And then that turned into the Agile Fluency project eventually.
Yes.
Taking enough of our time, we thought we better put a boundary around this. So
well, the interesting thing with it, you see it used a lot now. I myself have used it to create, what I call agility guides. Oh, let me thank you for not using the word maturity in any shape or form in any of the language that you've used in the fluency. And I often, when I'm talking with people who are creative, maturity is not a word you want in any kind of assessment or any kind of guide. It's bad enough you're assessing, right?
Yeah.
That language is damaging, because the minute you use maturity, this team gets measured against this team, gets measured against that team, and they're more mature, and it becomes an organizational hammer to hit on a nail, right?
Yeah. It's not that. Yeah. I don't know if James Shore wrote a new edition of his book, The Art of Agile Development, and it came out, his second edition came out last October. It's been almost a year. I wrote a couple of little pieces in it, but he and I also talked a lot about some of the early parts of the book, where he actually gives the most updated description of the Agile Fluency model, everything we've learned up until last October about how it gets used, what it means, what are the things. And the one thing that we did sort of figure out is, it's got 4 zones, and it starts with, people being able to do some really good stuff. We call the focusing zone, which is not a trivial shift at all, but it is kind of the beginning of being creating an agile team. It's all about describing agile team behaviors. And we said, people are always asking us, and we do know that people who are starting on this journey and get into the focusing zone, they start out needing a lot of help, and they need less help as they go along, and so on. And so we kind of had this epiphany that if there is something like a developmental cycle, if there is something like, forgive me, maturity happening, it's happening within the zones. It's not happening across the zones. The optimizing zone isn't more mature than the focusing zone if the optimizing zone isn't what you need. Then you're just wasting money. That's not more mature, right? But if it's what you need, then let's start looking at the optimizing zone and making sure you've got all those things going. So he wrote up a really nice description of our ideas about that. And so now that's one of the newer things that's being added into the Agile Fluency model, is this idea of, teams in the beginning, when they first enter a zone or are working to become fluent in that zone, they're going to need more help. And what we would hope is that eventually they would become very, very skilled, fully fluent in that zone. And that would probably mean that they don't need as much coaching. They don't need as much help. When there's turnover in their team, it maintains its culture. It maintains its fluency because the people who've been there before help to bring the new people up to speed. And that's what happens in cultures, right? That's when, yeah. So that was pretty exciting to kind of notice that we are still learning. It's been one of the pleasures of my life is that as I never expected to be a model builder. I always loved other people's models. And I love George Box. All models are wrong. Some are useful. I loved finding the usefulness of different models and noticing where they were less useful. And I never expected to be a model creator myself. And it was quite a surprise to me one day when I woke up and realized that way back when I created a team communication model, and then there was the retrospective model, and then there's it's like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this. But one of the really great things about it is you get a model to a good place where you think it could be useful to other folks. It's been useful to you, and you think you want to share it, and it's useful to other folks. You put it out there, and then it starts teaching you back.
Yeah.
And I love that part of it. I just love that part of it. It's so exciting to get close to that. Yeah, I think it's what it needs. We can't think of anything else to add to this. And then you put it out, and then other people say, oh, but it also does this. And I've used it that way. And it's like, yes, that's the best. That's the best. Yeah.
And I thank you for creating the model, because it's been in use around the world. We're very close to the end of our time, and I wanted to save a couple of minutes because there's a lot more we could talk about in that. We don't have the time. But I did want to, you mentioned it just briefly previously, and I wanted to save a spot for that, is you've got a new book coming out. And it's not due out until September. I know I've done the pre-order myself, and it's called Lead Without Blame, Building Resilient Learning Teams. Talk to me a little bit about that before we go.
Okay. Well, this is with a newer collaborator, Tricia Broderick, and this book has been a joy to create, because while I believe this book will be useful to folks in the Agile community and people who are in leadership roles at all levels in the Agile community, everybody can be a leader from time to time. And then some people have sort of formal titled leadership roles. And so it's for all those folks. The people in the Agile community will find sort of familiar themes, but we actually intend this book to go beyond the Agile community, to be more accessible to everyone who's thinking about business agility or just creating more effective workplaces from their leadership role, whatever that might be. And so it comes a lot out of our experience. And again, it comes a lot out of wide reading that we have done and bringing together ideas from other folks that we think are important. And the idea being that we just have moved beyond the place where the old ways of thinking about command and control and lead through punishment and create. I mean, Deming said all those years ago, drive fear out of the workplace. It's one of his management's 14 points, right? And we just don't listen to that. And so one of the ways that we see fear emerge in the workplace is this whole culture of judgment and blame and shame and we're going to hold your feet to the fire and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the reason why people turned away from postmortems when Norm Kurth wrote his Project Retrospectives book, and then Esther and I took it and applied it more into the Agile space, was people didn't like those after action reviews or postmortems because they turned into big blame sessions. It was all about figuring out who to point the finger at, right? And that never works. It never moves people forward. It never does. And so that's the kind of the starting point for Tricia and I. What do we need to do to help leaders get out of that? Because a lot of them, they lead that way because they think they're supposed to lead that way. That's how they've been told to lead. They've been told that that's what leadership is, and so we start from that premise and talk about, some of the fallacies that we believe about how businesses are successful that just aren't so, right? And so we start from that place, the application of blame and shame being one of them. And then we talk about, in this new world, we need to think in terms of teams, as at least as, if not more often than individual contributors. And so what we know something about how people are motivated to do work. Dan Pink has given us a bunch there, as well as other people. How do we motivate teams of people, which really is its own system and its own entity? And so what does motivation look like there? So we explore that for a bit. And then we explore for a bit, well, so if those are the things that are motivating, and we don't want you falling back into these old habits of blame and shame. What new behaviors do you later need to start developing? And so we have what we call the 4 C's model of a learning leader. And we make the point that the focus needs to be more on learning in this world that is so fast paced. We have to have great skills at learning, or we're not going to keep up. And so what do those leadership behaviors look like? And then what does that mean about teams? What are what we call the resilience factors? So we have essential motivators. We have a model for leadership behaviors. We have another set that we call the resilience factors for teams. What helps a team move beyond high performance team, which, while way more desirable than work groups, cooperating handoff work groups, high performing teams, much more desirable than that. But high performing teams can also get into kind of a repeatable rut kind of thing. And so, because they're relying on what they already know. And so we see that beyond that is this other form that we've begun to see in various places that we're calling resilient learning teams. People who don't know that they have to have the skills at learning to respond to all kinds of things, the complexity, the chaos, the VUCAs some people talk about. And so then we have 4 factors that we think are really critical to help enable in those teams. And of course, psychological safety is woven all the way through this, and a lot of other things that you might be familiar with. But we wrote the book about all those things, and then we looked at it and we said, and how do we make this book a learning tool? So we went back in and we went along the way and did some like thought experiments in it, and then some reflection questions for people who are reading it, and then some templates and if you want to do a retrospective around this what that might look like, because retrospectives obviously are a great tool for learning.
Yeah.
Right? And we're learning in groups. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell.
That's brilliant, and as I said, it's the 27th of September, and I'm looking forward to it, and I think after that description, a lot of other people will be wanting to read it, hopefully, for you. Look, we're right at the end of our time, and it's been fantastic having you on here. If anybody wants to get in touch with you or get involved with the Agile Fluency project in itself, how can they do that, Diane?
Well, agilefluency.org is the website for the Agile Fluency project. And there's a little bit about me and a little bit about Jim on that website. I also have my own website, dianalarsen.com. I'm on LinkedIn. Lots of people find me on LinkedIn. That's a good place. I'm not on a lot of social media, but I'm also on Twitter. And on Twitter, I am Diana of Portland. So I was early into Twitter, and somebody says, "Oh, you should create this catchy handle." And so I did. And then later on, I realized, oh, it should have been 3 letters long. Anyway, So those are all ways that people can get you. LinkedIn and Twitter are two of the easiest, really. Yeah.
Excellent. Look, thank you again for being on all the remote things. If you're listening to this, don't forget to go like, subscribe so we can keep this thing going. Remote Agility Framework Community, come and join us at that. So just go to remoteaf.co and click on the community button. We have a lot of like-minded individuals who are looking at how we can make remote and hybrid working better. Diana Larsen, thank you again for spending time with us today.
It's been delightful. Thank you, Tony.